So, of course, as always, I want to start by saying thank you, everyone, for joining. My name is Cody Armstrong, and today we're discussing best practices for data management in Onshape. So, today's webinar is going to be a bit different than a typical webinar for me. A lot of times we focus on the modeling tools. Today, we're going to focus more on the project structure aspects of Onshape. So, going to be a short webinar. We're really just going to focus on the best practices for how to structure your data in Onshape. And I think that's the best way to phrase this webinar because it's the question that we get asked most often. And so again, as many of our webinars are driven by your feedback. So this was definitely one of those cases we get asked the question often: how should I structure my projects? How should I structure my designs in Onshape? So that's the premise for this webinar. As always, feel free to ask any questions that you'd like. There's a questions section in the GoToWebinar control panel. Feel free to type in any question that you'd like, and I'll do my best to stop and answer the questions as we go through things here today. And again, it's going to be a short webinar. We're really just going to focus on a high level about how, what are the best techniques for managing and storing your data in Onshape. So let's get into it. As I mentioned before, the agenda is fairly straightforward. I just want to go over the tools and the techniques that you'll need to organize data in Onshape, to structure your data in Onshape. So what are the tools that we have available to us, and what are the best practices for using those tools? As always, feel free to ask any questions that you like. There's a question section in the GoToWebinar control panel, and I will stop and answer the questions as we start digging into things. But the agenda today, very straightforward, really just going to focus on the tools and, the proper techniques. All right, so one of the questions that I wanted to answer immediately is, what do I mean by data management? And in Onshape, data management kind of has a different meaning than many other systems. And I'm not referring to kind of the typical PDM level functions of data management. I'm not referring to like check in, check out, the file management aspects of data management. And that's just because, of course, we don't have the same structure, right? So just keep that in mind. We don't have that same, file-based architecture. I think that's the best way to phrase that, right? So what I'm referring to in Onshape, data management, when I refer to data management in Onshape, is how do I structure my projects? How do I structure my data? Right, in Onshape. And what I mean by structure is folders, documents. How do I mix these things in to make an architecture that makes sense, right? So let's get into it. If you are having any audio or video issues, please let me know. Let's dig right into it. Now, I want to start with the most common question that we get, and this is, one of the most important things I want to stress in this webinar today, and that is what goes into a single document. I think that's the most common question I get, and it's definitely the most important aspect of today's webinar. What goes into a single document? Should you put everything in a document? Should I put just a single part or single subassembly or a single file into a document? What is that look like? And to be honest, this varies company to company. Level of complexity makes a big difference. So the first thing I would stress is this is very much a company specific thing. If you have very complex products with thousands of parts and lots of subassemblies and drawings and details like that, then that's going to have an impact on how much you put into a single document. You probably break that up into multiple documents. But if your product is relatively simple, or it has a smaller part counts and less in terms of management aspects, less subassemblies, and so on, then putting everything into a single document makes sense. So there are some factors to consider. First off, the thing I would stress is you generally don't want to put everything project related, everything into a single document. And I say project related because that's one of the key aspects of data management. One of the easiest mistakes to make is to put every single design in a single document, right? Even if those designs are shared across multiple documents or multiple projects, even if those are copied between multiple places, and that's one of the most common mistakes that is easy to correct. So one of the first things I would stress is you generally don't want to put everything in a project, in a document. You only want to put data that's unique to that project. And so one of the common questions you have to ask yourself is, am I going to use this in other places? Right? That's the answer to that is going to determine whether it goes into the document for the project or it goes into its own document, right? In general, a good rule to follow is you only want to put data that's unique to that project in that document, right? You don't want to put other projects, designs in that document. You don't want to, put every single thing in there. If subassemblies are reused in other places, they should be in their own documents, right? Now, there's another end of this kind of spectrum of what goes in a single document, and then the other end of that is one part, one assembly, one drawing to a document. And that is an acceptable workflow, but it's generally reserved for the very big assemblies, very big drawings, and so on, right? Where breaking up the subassembly into even further elements makes a lot more sense. I think that's reserved for the biggest of designs, but it's something to consider if you fall into that category. If you fall into the thousands or tens of thousands of parts, and you want to be able to work with that at the top level, you may consider taking those subassemblies and breaking them into their own documents. And we're going to go over this in greater detail in just a bit. There are other factors to consider. A lot of times, PLM software, resource planning software, something along those lines will dictate how these things should be structured. Right, how subassemblies should be structured and what that hierarchy looks like. But I think the biggest question to ask yourself is this specific to this project, or is this something that's going to be used across multiple projects? Right? If it's specific to that project, it can go inside of that document. Right? The document is that project level container. But if it's not, and if it's reused in multiple places, you would want to put that into its own document. Right? All right, so what does this look like? This is a very simple example of what this structure looks like. The project document is that container, right? So the document in this case in Onshape is a container. It holds, as many parts as you want, assemblies and drawings, even imported files within that single project, right? Within that single document. So again, the key thing to keep in mind is you would only want to store parts, assemblies, or imported files that are related to that project. What you'll see on the right of this graphic is there are two outside influences on the project, and that is custom library components and reused data. And they're separated for a purpose. These are things that are used in multiple documents, multiple projects within my company, let's say. And we have what we call custom library components, and we have reused data. Custom library components are things that we work with that typically doesn't change, right? If you think of, maybe I do a lot of, electronic design, and I work with power supplies and boards and things like that. And those parts are pretty stagnant. They don't change often, and, it makes sense to just put them into a document for custom library components, right? So think of all those things that you interact with on a daily basis that generally don't change. A lot of times they're imported models, that come from a manufacturer or some kind of resource, and they generally don't update, right? And occasionally they do, there are new models, but for the most part, they're relatively stagnant designs. Those should be in their own document, right? Now, reused data is different. Reused data is subassemblies or things within my organization that we just happen to reuse in multiple projects, right? And the reason we distinguish between the two is reused data is likely to change, right? If I'm, building subassemblies and these subassemblies are used in multiple different projects within my company, it is likely that I'm going to change that subassembly and then expect those changes to update, right, in any of the places where that subassembly was inserted. So the distinction is important. I bring that up only to mention that you kind of have the custom libraries that maybe you import a lot of, but you also have reused data. And reused data is just generally parts or subassemblies that you've designed but are used in multiple projects, right? And the workflow might be slightly different between them. Why do I say that? In the case of custom library components, you can put a lot of things in a single document, right? If I think of, the pumps, the motors, the power supplies, the kind of general parts that I work with on a day-to-day basis, I can put those into even a single document, version it and insert it anywhere I want, and be comfortable knowing that those things are rarely going to change, right? Whereas reuse data is a bit different. Reuse data, it is likely to change. And so if I take every subassembly that my company uses that's shared and I put them all into one document, then if I change one subassembly, the entire document has to be versioned in order for it to propagate, right, downstream. So in general, reused data that my company designed that's used in multiple places, belongs in its own independent documents. I would not lump all reused data together in one document. I hope that makes sense. The distinction that's important there is, versions. When you go to create a version, you create a version at the document level, right? And so, for reused data, I would want to make sure that those individual subassemblies are their own documents. I hope that makes sense. I know we're getting in kind of the weeds here on the level of granularity that you structure your data in, but this is admittedly the most simple example I can give you. The top level project, your document is that project level container, and within it you have part studios, you have assemblies, you have drawings, you have imported files, basically anything you want that's project related. Then you have these other documents that store things that are not project specific. Custom libraries, reuse data, and how you choose to structure that is up to you, right? What I'd recommend though is think about how often is this likely to change. If the answer to that is often, right, in the case of reuse data, that might be quite often, it really should be in its own document, right? It should not be lumped together with other reuse data. It's fairly safe to put all of your standard library parts that don't change often together in a same document. All right, so that's a simple example. What about taking this to the next level? And this is especially important for enterprise customers or customers that have large projects inside of Onshape, because you take all of that and it really becomes cumbersome when you start having thousands of parts in a single document, right? And searching through and finding things, performance. There's a lot of reasons why splitting up at that level makes a lot of sense. Now, again, keep in mind this is really specific to what you do. Not all companies have assemblies at this size. But if you do, things to consider. In Onshape, we have the concept of a document folder. You can store documents within a folder. I'm going to go over the specifics of this when we go over the tools for organization in just a bit. But it's important to keep in mind you can have folders and you can have subfolders, and you can store documents within each one of those levels. And so it's very common in larger projects to take a folder and start with a folder. And within that folder, you may have one document and several subfolders, right? And the subfolders may consist of subassemblies, right? Single documents. And then you have, multiple documents underneath that subassembly folder. This starts to look very familiar to or similar to a file-based structure. And if that's how you choose to view it, that's fine. A lot of the folder architecture that I've seen built in Onshape was really driven from how things were stored as files. It really just depends on how you choose to structure your data. Again, I would consider this approach, the top level being a folder and then having documents or subfolders within that, really specific to kind of the bigger designs or the areas where storing everything in a single document just becomes cumbersome or too difficult to to discern what is what. Right? And I think that's really where the trouble starts to be, when you need to find something quickly, and having it all inside one document just doesn't lend itself well to that. The other thing I would stress about this is at all levels in this, at the top level, document, the sub documents, the sub project documents inside the subfolders, at any of these levels, you can insert custom library components or reused data, right? So we talk about those. Those are non-project specific things that are shared across multiple projects. At any level, from the top level to subassemblies to individual parts even, you could insert these custom library components or general reused parts or subassemblies, right? But the key here is with these much larger documents, we're talking again, large in scale, large in size, it's really worth considering, breaking that document up into multiple documents. And the example I would give is something like an engine block, or a car, for instance, taking up the next level. A car, you would have an engine, you'd have a frame, you'd have suspension, and each one of those at that level would be its own document. I'd have an engine document, and within the engine document, I'd have subassemblies for crankshafts and cylinder heads and all the various pieces. But the car is the top level folder, the top level project, right? And within that top level folder, I may have several subfolders for each of the big subassemblies that I would consider important. And within each of the subassembly folders, I would have documents for each of the different pieces of the subassemblies. So a car is a good example. I think everyone kind of understands the various pieces of it, and it's also very big, right? It tends to be a large number of parts. So that's something to consider when we start talking about document organization. The simplest example is a single document, and everything project specific goes within that document, and that works well. Again, until you start to really get into hundreds or thousands of parts, where that paradigm just doesn't fit as well, right? Question: can we enforce a folder structure within a document? That is, can we make a document structure template or use some other method to enforce or at least encourage a standard structure for our documents? Very good question. And unfortunately, I think the short answer is no. I mean, there's no way to drive a template, so to speak, today that does that. Technically, I could create a document and tell everyone to copy that, but that's not quite, I suspect, what you're asking. It would be a workaround to what you're asking. But I think the short answer is no, not today. What if I wanted to do that, I would share a document with everyone, say, use this to start every new document, right? Create a copy of it or something to that effect. But I know that has been asked before. The ability to set more than just your units or your decimal length or those kinds of things as a part of a template, I know has been requested before. If you haven't already, please submit that through our feedback tool. But I definitely think that's a good one. So again, question: will Onshape work offline? No. Very important. Onshape needs an internet connection. You can use a 3G connection. It doesn't need to be a fast connection. If you can tether to your phone, you can use Onshape. It doesn't need a fast connection. It just needs a consistent one. But it does not work online. Question: are there any plans to version at the part or tab level similar to how releases work? Yes, absolutely. Very good question. I mentioned before, when you create a version, you create it at the document level. It versions everything in the document. There have been a number of requests, and there are plans in place to make that more specific, right? So I can go in and say I want to version this specific tab within a document, or part within a part studio, very similar to releases, as you mentioned. So I would say yes. I don't have any specific timelines, but I will say that has been requested by a number of individuals. And I would say along those same lines, sharing of versions and sharing of tabs are very much on our radar, just to kind of tie in that whole theme of tab-specific functionality or part-specific functionality. All right, so I mentioned before, if you're at the simpler level of design, I don't want to make it sound like there's one aspect and another, but if you're kind of on the 1,000 parts or less, or you're in that scale of we don't build cars, or we don't build these multi-thousand part assemblies, this will probably work for you. This is probably the structure I would recommend. Have a document and have all the parts or assemblies that are unique to that project in that document. It's really when you start getting into much larger projects that I would consider this structure, where you have a top level folder, you have subfolders, you have different documents for different sub-assemblies. The car is a good example. I would put the engine and the frame and the suspension in different documents, just for the case of performance, for organization, for a number of different reasons. All right, so now let's get into the tools. So we discussed the techniques. These are the kind of high-level techniques that I would recommend, or ways that I would recommend storing your data. But how do we accomplish this? So there's really two facets that I wanted to discuss. How do we organize data inside of a document? And how do we organize data how do we organize documents themselves, right? How do we create folders and store the documents within those? So I'm going to go over those two aspects. Question: will Onshape export to CAM systems? Yes. Yes, you can export to a number of different formats, and most any CAM system today will support them for import. So yeah. All right, so let's start with in-document organizational tools. And as I mentioned before, this is how we organize a document, not how we organize a series of documents, but inside of a document, how do we structure that, right? And I think there's two important aspects to in-document organization that I would stress: folders for tabs and the tab manager. Right, those two elements or those two pieces of organization are kind of critical to how you structure your data, right? So let's take a look at that. Let's jump into this. Bear with me for just 1 second here. What I'd like to do is jump into a document here we have called organization. Now, one of the things I want to stress, I'm going to use this document for a few different things, and kind of show you some bad practices and how you can alleviate those. So this is an example of a sheet metal enclosure. And I'm designing the sheet metal enclosure, but I work around all of these imported models, right? And you can see them. If you look down here, I have power supply, I have fan, I have emergency stop button, I have all of these boards that I work with. These are excellent examples of library components, right? Things that I use that are part of my library that are not specific to this project, right? These power supplies and e-stop buttons, I use these in multiple places in my designs, multiple different projects. But you can see that each one is a tab within this document, right? So I've essentially brought every single part into this document, and that's one of the most common mistakes to make, right? Now I'm going to go over how to fix that in just a moment, but one of the questions that comes up is, well, I have all of these tabs. How can I collapse them? How can I store them in a way that's more specific, right? That allows me to break down my document into different criteria. Maybe you like to structure your document as parts, assemblies, and drawings, and you want to have a folder for parts, folder for assemblies, folder for drawings. That's fine. Maybe you want to have a folder for imported files. Maybe you import a lot of files into a document. You don't want to have a whole bunch of tabs for each import. Store them all in a folder. So how do we create a folder in the document? Inside of the document, in the bottom left corner, there's a plus, and you have the option to create a folder. So the same place that you'd go to create a new drawing, a new assembly, there's also this option to create a folder. If I click Create Folder, it creates a new tab called Folder 1. And let's just call this, let's say, Hardware. Right? So now I have a tab called Hardware, but that tab is actually a folder. It allows me to store other tabs. And the way that I can access, or the way that I can add things to this folder, is just by left-clicking and dragging those tabs over the folder. Right, so now I'm just dragging the fan, the power supply, these miscellaneous parts into this hardware folder, right, inside of the document. And so now in just a few drags here, I can easily collapse this list of tabs. Again, very important if you're importing a lot of files, or if you just like to structure your tabs in a meaningful way, right? So you don't have to hunt. I've seen a lot of users that will scroll back and forth through the tabs, kind of hunting through what they're looking for. Folders help you to find that quicker, right? It allows me to drill down into different categories of my document and find the things I need faster. Now, that's creating folders at the document level, inside of a document. And one of the questions that comes up I want to answer is, how do I get everything out? You can right-click and unpack a folder, and it will take everything and move it back out of that folder, back up a level, so to speak, right? So very important to keep in mind. You can also, by the way, I should mention this, Tab Manager here. You can also access all of this via the Tab Manager. And if you're not familiar with it, this is a very important aspect of getting around inside of a document. In fact, one of my biggest tips for organization inside of a document is heavy use of the tab manager. I think the power users out there that are effectively organized in their documents are using a lot of the tab manager. So if you're not familiar with it, in the bottom left corner, we have the tab manager, little icon here. And from within this tab manager, I can expand out folders. I can select multiple parts. So if I wanted to say shift select a dozen imported files and drag them into a folder, I can do that from the tab manager, right? So I can grab these and drag them, or I can add them to another folder. I can have subfolders within this document and then store those tabs within that subfolder. So one of the biggest tips that I can give you is this tab manager, because if you've already got a document, you've already got 25 tabs, and you want to put them all into a folder, dragging each one manually is certainly not practical, right? Or at least not fun. So the tab manager allows you to interact with your tabs in a much more efficient way. You can even do things like filter, show me just the parts that match this name, or sort by name or sort by type, right? So I can sort by different things. But important to keep in mind, tab manager, one big benefit that I would point out, it allows you to do things like move things in and out of folders very easily, move multiple things together very easily, that would not be easily done any other way. One other tip that I would give you, this is definitely a power user tip, but something that I would recommend for the most organized out there is the keyboard shortcut for Tab Manager. And the reason I mention that is because I can get to the tab that I want very quickly. So the keyboard shortcut is Alt-T, right? So Alt-T on your keyboard, and the reason I bring this up is, let's say, for instance, I wanted to switch tabs. I could use Alt-T, type in the assembly name that I wanted, right? Assembly 1, let's say, right? Enter, and now I've switched tabs without moving my mouse around, without selecting anything, without hunting for the tabs across the bottom. So if you're a big fan of keyboard shortcuts, Alt-T brings up the tab manager. You can immediately start typing to search for things, hit enter, and it will switch tabs into that. Definitely a power user tip, but probably one of the fastest ways to get around inside of a document, especially if you have lots of subfolders and, drilling down, left-clicking each individual one when you know exactly what you want is just not practical, right? At least not fast. All right, so question. What I would like to do is store other project-related documents, Excel, Word. However, they do not display in Onshape and have to be downloaded again to view. How would you suggest I handle these, please? Very good question. So the question is, I want to store other data inside of my document, specifically Word and Excel files, right? But they do not display inside of Onshape. If you click on an Excel file, it will not load. And that's because we don't have the viewers embedded inside of Onshape, or it's out of your browser, more specifically, to view native Word or Excel files. Anything that's visible or viewable by your browser will be viewable in the document. So text files, G-code files, video files, PDFs, images, you can see those inside of a document. Anything specific like Word and Excel, you cannot. If it's an option, you could save the Word or the Excel as a PDF or a text or an image, and that will render inside of Onshape. I don't know if that's an option or a workaround in this case, but that's something to consider. That's probably what I've seen most commonly if you need to see the Excel spreadsheet or the Word doc inside of the document. PDF, text, images all render well, so if you can convert to one of those, that's probably the best bet. Good question. Can we put the tab manager view in a separate browser instance? No, but that would be a very neat bit of functionality. If you haven't already, definitely submit that one as feedback. As of today, it is fixed on that left side of the screen, but that would be useful. I can definitely see the use in separating that out and just having it up all the time. Question. So we have 1,000 parts. We have 1,000 different subfolders and documents. Each document contains all the parts for a complete weldment. However, we need to use one of those specific parts on a completely different machine's weldment. Is it best to link to the original weldments part or create the part in a non-machine specific folder? So very good question. Just going to paraphrase a bit. I have this weldment. We have each part of the weldment in its own document, and then we realize that one of the pieces of the original weldment is also in a different project, right? Or it's in something else. What I would recommend is actually moving that part to its own document, or inserting just for if it's in its own document already, putting that into its own folder. Um, I would not leave things inside of a project specific document or folder. I would move it out the moment it's shared. I hope that answers the question. But again, and that's going to be a very common thing. You'll initially design things, you'll do a whole bunch of design work, and then you'll later realize, oh, this subassembly is actually used in multiple places. Or 6 months from now, we realize, oh, we need to reuse this thing we designed 6 months ago that was project specific, but is now not. What do you do in those situations? And I would recommend move to document, right? And then you can move that document to a folder if you wanted to. Depends on how you have your setup. But moving it outside is kind of critical. I'm going to go over that in just a moment, so bear with me. Can we have these parts in their own documents and use them in the assembly? Yes, absolutely. Using linked documents, and I'll go over that as well. Good question. Will an Office 365 cloud version of an Excel work as a tab? It's not going to work directly, but there is I forget the name of it now. There's an app in the App Store that allows you to link to essentially any cloud-based service, and if that's what you're referring to, I think that may work. I haven't tried it personally with Office 365, but I know it works with like Google Sheets. So I would just have to try it myself with Office 365, but I think that would work. I forget the name. Forgive me. If you stick around for the end, I will remember it. But you're essentially inserting a link to another, another site, like Google Sheets or Office 365. And if that's what you're referring to, I think that would work as a tab. Will Onshape export to ERP or MRP? There are export options, yes. Most commonly CSVs. So what I've seen most companies do if they're working with an ERP or MRP software is they take the bill of materials that's generated and they export that as a CSV. And you could use the API to automate tasks and things like that associated with it. But in short, I think the most companies working with MRPs or ERP software today using Onshape are exporting data out as CSV and then bringing that data into their ERP solution. All right, so now let's get into the next topic that I had for you. Bear with me here. And that is document page organizational tools. So we talked about tools inside of a document, right? So here's how you create folders inside of a document. Here's how you move things around inside of folders inside of a document. But how do we organize the documents themselves, right? So when you first sign into Onshape, you're taken to the documents page, and that's just your list of projects, right? Your list of documents. How do we organize that list? How do we make sense of all these documents that we've created? And there's really two ways to do this, essentially. There's labels and there's teams. And I want to stress both of them because they each have their kind of independent use cases, but they are definitely worth checking out if you're asking yourself, how do I start organizing my documents? So let's go over those. I'm going to start with labels. And I want to mention labels because it's an easy way to tag a document with some kind of a description. And the reason I mention that is it's just frequently asked. If I'm creating documents, let's say that I'm working on a series of documents that manage linear actuation, right? And I want to be able to easily filter by the 5 documents that I know are associated with linear actuation. That's where I would create a label. And then I would tag the documents with that label, and then I can easily find them from the documents page. Right? So that's one of the first important things I would stress. Now, how do you create a label? There's a little icon here at the top right of the documents page. It looks like a little tag. That's where you go to create a label. Right? So you click there, you'll see this button, create new label. I could say linear actuators, right? Yeah, right. Okay. And now I've created a new label. Right? Now I can go to any document, find that document, and just click linear actuator, and now I've applied the label to a document. right? And so now, anytime I go to linear actuator label, it's going to filter by documents tagged with that label, right? If I want to remove the tag, I can go back to the labels, uncheck, and now it's no longer associated with that label. But again, the key to labels, you'll find at the top right, you can create new labels here. You can define what labels apply. The important thing to stress is you'll want to select a document first, then choose the label that you want to apply to that document. So it's dependent on having them selected. You can also shift select or control select documents at the document's page level. Very important for applying labels. So say, for instance, you have 20 documents that you want to apply one label to. I can shift select all of them and then apply the label rather than doing it one at a time. Comment, is the app link tab for Onshape? Yes. I believe the app that we were talking about earlier is called AppLink, right? So if you're interested in how you would link to another cloud-based service directly inside of Onshape, AppLink is probably what I would refer you to. All right, so that is creating labels. Very important to stress because, again, it allows me to tag documents by a specific string of text that's easily searchable, easily filterable, right? I can easily go through and filter by it. One important thing I would stress about labels is they only apply to you. So if I apply a label, it's not seen by any other users, right? It's something specific to what I do, and that's the question that came up next. Can the labels be common amongst team members, or are they just within the scope of a user? In short, they are just within the scope of a user. If you're looking for something similar, what I'd recommend is folders, because if you create a folder and store a document within it, it's the same amongst all team members, right? Oh, I'm sorry. It's called Link Tab. Link Tab for Onshape. So this is for the question earlier about inserting things like Office 365, Word, or Excel docs. Link Tab would be what I refer to. Question, what is faster, using the document search or tag searches? Tag searches are going to be quicker to load. The document search, especially when you get into advanced search, will need to go into the document, into descriptions and things like that. So in terms of like load times and things like that, I think the label search is going to be a bit quicker. All right, so let's move on. Now, I mentioned labels. Labels are very important to me and how I organize my data, but they don't apply to anyone else in my company, right? So they're really only a tool for you as a user. But how would I go about structuring my data so that I can share it with my teams, right? And that's the most common question we get is, I'm getting started on Onshape. We have a dozen documents, 100 documents that we need to share with our entire engineering team. What's the best way to do that? And in short, there are two things I would stress here. First, teams in Onshape. We have a concept called teams, which we'll go over in just a bit. And then we also have folders. Folders, I can put a whole bunch of documents into a folder and then share that with the team. And then with one share, everyone has access to the documents they need, right? It could be many different documents inside of a folder, and I can share it with just one share, right? All right, so let's go over Teams first. So in the top right corner, there's your username. If you go to your account settings, you have Teams, right? So within Teams, as the name implies, you have your existing teams, or I can create new teams, right? So I could create a new team and then go through and add them to that team. Adding people to the team, very straightforward. Type in their email address, define their role within the team. So very important to stress, do you want that person to be an admin of the team or just a member? Admins can add others to the team, and they have other certain permissions that are specific to the team. Members can only edit, view, whatever the permissions are that you assign to the data that you're giving them, but they can't add other individuals to that team. So adding team members, relatively simple. Just type in their email address, define what their role is, and hit add. And that will add them to that team. Now, the reason this is so important is once you have a document, or once you have a series of documents that you want to share with a group of individuals like that team, you don't have to share with them one at a time. If I go to share, I could go to teams and then choose the team that I want, right? So I can say I want to share with the industrial team, right? And with that one team selection, I could be sharing with a dozen or 2 dozen or 100 different individuals, right? But without having to type in individual email addresses, right? Now, most importantly, what this allows me to do, let's go back to the documents page here, is I can filter by documents that are shared with the team. And I think, in my opinion, that's one of the biggest benefits. Here I can see, okay, show me every document shared with the industrial team, right? And you can see here, worm gear, and then a folder within that. But it's an easy way to filter. If things are shared with a team, I can easily go into that team, filter by that, and see the documents that pertain to that team, right? So it's a very efficient filtering mechanism. It's very efficient sharing mechanism, something that I would definitely stress. If you're not using Teams today, definitely create a few teams. It will save you a tremendous amount of time sharing individual documents, right? And also, it's just a great filter option, right? All right, so those are the organizational tools of the documents page. There's one that we've left out, and that is folders. In my opinion, this is the biggest organizational tool that we have for documents today, and that is the folder. In short, you could create folders and store documents within folders. They're relatively simple. It's not a new concept, but it's something that almost everyone is familiar with and has requested in the past. And in short, you create a folder, you store documents within that folder. You can have subfolders. So I was showing you earlier that hierarchy of top-level subfolders, documents within subfolders. That is possible via creating those subfolders. There are a few important tips that I'm going to go over, but let's just jump right into it. Let me get to a couple questions. Okay. Definitely thank you for making any improvement requests that you have. We appreciate all feedback that you give, so please don't hesitate. I am exploring labels. How can I add a lot of projects to a label at once? Please demonstrate. The key to any applying of multiple labels or anything at once is shift selecting or control selecting, right? And then from there, I can choose a label. Basically, anything selected will have that label apply. So say, for instance, I want this document, and I want this document, and I want this one, and I want this one applied to a label. I'd hold Control or Command, depending on however, Windows or Mac, and then it selects all 4 of those. Then when I click Linear Actuator, it applies that label to all 4 documents. Again, the key is just selecting multiple documents from that documents page. Shift select, Control select are the two techniques that we have there. Question: is there a user or a member type that is read only? No, that's defined by the permissions that you give them. So when you go to define team, you can say, team that can only view, right? I can define that as permissions, but that's done in the share. A team is really just a group. There's no way to define a member solely as view only at the team level. It's done on a per document basis. Question: the documents view, I can sort on modified field. Can or will we be able to sort on the modified or owned by fields? Very good question. I've asked for that myself. Definitely use the feedback tool and let us know. I think the more users we get requesting that, the more likely it is to be bumped up in the list of priorities. But very good observation. You can sort by modified, and it will sort by the latest modified or the oldest, depending on how you filter it. But you can't yet sort by today, modified by, or owned by, or those fields. So. Question: will Onshape export to PDF? I just step DXF. Yes. Yes to all of those. All right. So now let's move on to folders. Now, you can see I already have a few folders here. So I'm on the documents page, and you can see I have a few different folders already created. Let's go through creating a folder and then drill into how to use it. So the first thing, how do you create a folder? It's in the top left corner. So in the top left corner, there's a big create button. You click create. then you choose the option for folder, right? Create a folder. Let's call this linear actuator, right? I click create, and now I have a new linear actuator folder in my list, right? So very important to point out, now I've created my folder. If I want to browse into the folder, I just left click on it. Now you can see I've left clicked on the linear actuator folder. There's nothing in it. There's no subfolders. There's no documents within this folder. So the question then becomes, how do I move documents to a folder? How do I create new documents in a folder? And how do I create subfolders? So let's answer that last one first. How do I create a subfolder? It's important to understand that anything you do while inside of a folder is considered, stored inside that folder. So I'm currently inside of the linear actuator folder. You can see it says my Onshape and then the arrow indicating you're inside of my Onshape and the linear actuator folder. If I go to click create and create a new document or create a new folder, the document or folder will belong to this linear actuator folder. So if I click create folder, I say hardware, I'm now creating a subfolder within the linear actuator folder called hardware, right? If I go into this folder and then choose create document, I'm creating a document within that subfolder, right? So I hope that makes sense. Again, you see what folder you're currently in at the top here, and I can also go back, by the way, by just clicking these links. But anything that I do while inside of that, any kind of creation that I do while inside of that folder, that thing, that document or that folder will belong to that, right? All right, question. What is the designator workspace? In Onshape, we have workspace in a document. That's just your place to design. That's parts, assemblies, or drawings. The reason we have the definition of a workspace is you can have multiple workspaces within a document. And I can have a separate workspace that's independent of one another, all within the same document. You can think of a workspace as a totally independent sandbox within the document for you to work. And you can have multiple if you need to, right? If you're interested, I would definitely check out the topic of branching. Branching and merging goes over workspaces and how to create multiple. Question, will Onshape parametrically mask change by Excel? No. There's no way to, well, I should say there's no way programmatically, or there's no way without programming. It would probably be possible using some kind of code, but today there's no specific like import Excel buttons or functions inside of Onshape, right? There is an API where things can be programmed, but there's no specific function that will do that today. Is there a way to drag a document from the main workspace to a subfolder in one step? I'm not sure you understand the workspace. So is there a way to drag a document from one folder to a subfolder, I'm assuming? And the answer is move to. You could right click and move to. Right? Question, is the API DLL the only way to make a parametric program? Onshape itself is parametric. The CAD system itself is parametric. If I change a dimension, everything driven by that dimension, right? If you're asking about how to parametrically link mass to an Excel file, yeah. Okay, so that is creating folders, creating subfolders, and creating documents within folders, right? So if I create a document here, let's call it linear actuator, right? Okay, now I've created a new document inside of the hardware subfolder inside of the linear actuator top level, right? So if I go back to my Onshape is your top level. Think of that as the highest level in your directory, right? And then from within that, I could go to linear actuator, hardware, and there's my linear actuator document. Right? Now, the question then comes up, well, how do I move things around? What if I wanted to move something from a top level to a subfolder? What if I wanted to move something from just the general high level my Onshape into a subfolder? And the short answer to that is you would right click and move to. Very important to point out, though, you must have the appropriate permissions to the document, right? So if I right-click a document, you'll see this option to move to. Now, you won't be able to move a document that you have view permission to into a folder and give yourself edit permission. So one of the most common questions I get when I show move to is, why don't I see move to when I right-click a document? And the chances are you do not have the permission necessary to move that document into something else. You need the edit permissions, the ability to change the permissions of the document, because when you move a document to a folder, you're changing its permissions, right? The document will inherit the folder permissions, right? So very important to point out. But again, if you want to move a document or a series of documents, let's say that I have a dozen documents that I want to move to a folder, I could do the same shift select or control select that I showed you a moment ago. Then just right click and say move to, right? Then choose the folder that I want to move that document to, right? Say move here, and it will move that document to the folder. So again, 2 ways to create a document in a folder, or 2 ways to get a document into a folder. Create the document initially in that folder, or move it by right-clicking and choosing the option to move to. Again, the key thing to stress is the document will inherit the permissions of the folder. So if I create a folder and I share it with edit permissions to my engineering team, and I move a document into that folder, the engineering team automatically gets those edit access to that folder, right? And the document within it, right? Important thing to stress: the permissions are inherited, which means, let's say that I've moved 20, 30, 40 documents into a folder. How do I share that with the team? It's the same exact process as sharing a document. I could right click the folder and say share, and I can choose my team and give them the permission that they need. Right? Now I'm sharing not just a single document with the team, but a collection of documents stored in a folder with the team. Right? Now, permissions are additive. So the question that I often get asked is, okay, I've shared my permission. Let's say that I give the industrial team view-only access. Right? So I'm sharing this folder consisting of many different documents. I'm sharing it with the industrial team, but they can only look at it, at the moment. So again, very easy to do. The important thing to stress is, you define what goes into the folder, and then you define, what the permissions are. Now, if you give them, for instance, view permissions, but let's say, for instance, there's 1 or 2 documents within this folder that they need additional permissions to. The document level permissions can be additive on top of the folder permissions. So if I give them view access at the folder level, but then I go into 1 or 2 documents and I share those explicitly, those individual documents explicitly with edit permissions, it will allow them to edit the 2 documents without allowing them access to all the other documents, right? So I hope that makes sense. The permissions are additive. The base permissions are applied at the folder level. And then any permissions that are in addition to that would be applied either at the subfolder or at the document level, right? You would open up the document and change the permissions there. Okay, so that is creating folders, sharing folders, again, and moving to a folder. And that's, again, the important workflows that you'll need to know when you're getting started creating folders. Now, there's really one last thing that I wanted to kind of wrap things up here with today, and that is the idea of move to document. So I mentioned this earlier. It's very easy when you're initially designing, when you're first getting started, to have everything in the same document. And then you later realize, oh no, these should be in different documents. These are subassemblies that we use in multiple places, or these are library parts that we use in multiple projects. They should really not be in this document. They should be in their own. And so the question comes up, how do I move something from one document to another, after it's already been added to it? And the short answer is the move to document. A good example of this is this sheet metal enclosure that we were looking at earlier. The sheet metal enclosure includes power supplies, fans, emergency stop buttons, inlets, power, all kinds of different things that are generic geometry. These are things that don't change often, and they should really be in their own document because I use them in multiple places. So what I'm going to do is take all of these standard hardware parts. These are really library components for us. and I'm going to move them to a different document, right? So I'm just going to the tab manager. I'm selecting all of these parts, or assembly, could be really anything that you want, and I'm saying move to document. All right, this is just a right-click menu option. So when I choose move to document, I have two options. I can create a new document, or I can choose an already existing document. So if I already have a document of library parts, I could choose that document and move all these parts to that document. Or if this is my first, crack at creating library documents, I can just say, well, this is a new document, and we'll call it library components. It's important to stress when you do a move to document, it grabs all of the references. So if you do a move to document of an assembly, it's going to grab all the part studios that belong to that or that are inserted into that assembly. Same goes for drawings. If you do a move to document of a drawing, it's going to grab any references and move that as well. Right? So very important to stress. But this is how you take something that was built in the wrong place and move it to the right place. And that's a question that comes up often. It's very easy to say in hindsight, this is how you should have structured it. But oftentimes, the creation process is very messy. And you're just creating things in different places. And it isn't until you've gotten to a fairly substantial point that you realize this should be structured in this way. And for those scenarios, move to is going to be very, very important, because you can take those parts or assemblies or imported files that were put in the wrong place and put them in the right place, right? So that's really all there is to the move to. Again, you're just right-clicking on tabs at the document and saying move them to this document. That will automatically move them. One other thing I would stress about this is this doesn't break every reference. So it will move the parts to a different document, but will automatically link anywhere that was inserted to the new document. So you don't have to worry about going back and reinserting everything after it was moved. This isn't kind of that file-based nature where if you move a file from one folder to another, everything falls apart. This is not the case. So if you right-click some tabs, you say to move into another document, it will automatically link to that new document anywhere those were inserted. So I hope that makes sense. One last thing that I'd stress again is we just created that new document, right? And now we could go in and find it, right? Open it up, continue working on it, and here's the library components. So it created this document, but now, most importantly, now I can insert this power supply or this fan into multiple places, and it's referencing this library document and not the project-specific document. So I hope that makes sense. But again, moving these library parts or the reused data into its own document is probably one of the biggest tips that I can give you. It's one of the easiest mistakes to make as a new user. You really want to ask yourself as often as possible, am I going to reuse this anywhere else? Right? If the answer to that is yes, it should really be in its own document. Now, whether that's in its own document or another document of library components, that's up to you and depends on how often you change things. If you change things often, it's probably best to put it in its own document. But, things like fans or power supplies or pumps or motors, things that don't change that often, they could easily go into, one big document, right? All right, so that is what I had planned for you. I have 2 minutes left. I'm going to leave that open for a few outstanding questions that I see. So that is what I had planned. One other thing I would stress is at the Onshape Learning Center, learn.onshape.com, there's a lot of great organizational tips. There's a technical briefing specifically on this subject. So if you're looking for follow-up or you're looking for more info on teams, on folder creation, on best practices for data management, definitely check out the Onshape Learning Center. There's technical briefings on the subject. There's self-paced training, instructor-led training that goes over this and a number of other things. But definitely worth checking out if you're interested in more info on this topic. So that's what I had planned. I am going to stick around for a few more minutes and answer any questions that you have. So please type them in if you have them. But that's it, everyone. Thank you. Have a good day.